So I'm going to stay here until it's safe for us all to leave.
Yeah.
I'm just outside DC.
Oh, okay. Cool.
I see we're live on YouTube.
Oh, yeah. Cool. Mm-mm.
Everyone goes quiet.
Yeah, right.
Right.
No one wants to be caught in the middle of a bad joke. Whatever.
Yeah.
Right. Yes. It is a little bit disorienting, although we're speculative fiction writers, so we should be totally up with the sense of disorientation or floating free from our base, which is what I always feel like with Zoom, since I never know where anyone is and they could be lying. I mean, I could be anywhere.
True.
Yeah, that could be a fake background. I could be having a fake
Right.
Sippy Award.
Okay, I think we are live. Hello and welcome to the OutWrite panel on queer community in speculative fiction, or speculative communities in queer fiction. I'm Ruthanna Emrys, and I am moderating the panel. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the author of the Innsmouth Legacy series, which is very much about community building, as well as a book of short stories, imperfect commentaries, out of Lethe Press. And I'm going to try to mostly shut up, which is something I'm quite bad at, and go around the virtual room and ask everyone to introduce yourselves and briefly share something about queer community in your life. And I can start with that one as well. I live in what is essentially a tiny queer commune slash role-playing group with 6 other adults and 2 kids that we are raising in our weird little queer group, along with 7 cats, 2 dogs, and a very strange parrot. So we're all nerds, and we had spent a lot of time thinking about how our community might prepare us for various science fictional scenarios, and we now find ourselves in one. So everything started up in March, and we said, okay, we guess this is the ragtag band of misfits that we have to fly this starship in, and that's what we've been doing for a very long March. And with that, I will pass it over. Start with Craig.
I am the author of a book about, I guess, a queer artist community. It's called A Spectral Hue, and it's a ghost story set in a small town on the eastern Maryland shore, and there's a mysterious art movement, and everyone in the book just happens to be Black and queer. And I happen to live in a all gay male household with all of the attendant problems that you could imagine. But we get along pretty well.
Right, Darcy.
Unmuted myself. I'm Darcy Little Badger, and I am a sci-fi fantasy horror author with a debut book coming out in less than a month. This is August 25th is when you can get Alatzoe. It's a young adult fantasy mystery. But actually, one intriguing thing about this panel was it comes at a time when I'm writing another young adult book that specifically explores the subject of family in terms of found family. Without saying too much about it, the main character is forced to leave his home, and then throughout the book he meets people and learns to love them, and eventually goes to great lengths to protect his family. Let's see, my pronouns are she, her, and I am engaged to a veterinarian who cosplays Cassandra Pentgast, is that how you pronounce it? She's from Dragon Age, as well as Luke Skywalker. And our wedding was delayed a year, but it's worth the wait. So it's good to be here, everybody.
Welcome. Jewel.
Hi, I'm Jewel Gomez, and she, her. And let's see, queer family. Well, I don't have as crowded a household as you, Craig, and Ruth Anna. My spouse, Diane, and I are, as she calls it, she doesn't call it sheltering in place. She calls it something else, cuddling in place here. And it's interesting to think about queer community and households. I feel like what's happened is the people that I talk to the most on Zoom, and people are really determined to have Zoom conversations with you, even though in the past, maybe they only saw you once a year. Now they want to talk to you once a month over Zoom. And so I got all these lesbians showing up on my Zoom doorstep that want to chat. And it's interesting. It's a little bit unexpected, but it's interesting because you do get a more kind of in-depth knowledge of friends when you have a regular time set up to talk to them, and you know you're going to be on the phone for 40 minutes, and you can actually see them, but they're at a certain kind of distance, and I believe people talk differently. So I have like 6 lesbian friends that I talk to regularly, and I feel like they're my Zoom lesbian family now. And I love it. I don't know, my novel, The Gilda Stories, which has been in print for more than 25 years, actually, which is kind of bizarre that to have a book that's older than many of my friends. But it really does depend on the idea of queer family. And using the vampire, it's a first Black lesbian vampire novel, and it uses the idea of the vampire family as a prototype of a lesbian or a queer family, actually. So that was fun to create. I didn't know that's what I was doing when I wrote it, but it works out. That's me. That's me.
Sorry, everyone froze up on me. Are people back now?
Yeah.
I'm going to assume it's my turn then, and I'll just go. I'm Ebony. I am based in the Bay Area. My pronouns are she, her. I have a novella coming out in about a month, a little bit over a month now. It's right here in the corner, Stone and Steel, which is a lot about queer community. I think for me personally, I don't have a ton of IRL queer community to engage with, so I'm constantly writing about it and imagining what that life would be like to have really close friends who are like family. And so that's something I often explore in my own work.
Who hasn't gone?
Okay, I think that's everyone. I apologize. I am getting people fading in and out here. So I'm...
Like right now you froze.
Yeah, I think perhaps it's a connection issue.
Yeah. This kind of has happened to me on Zoom. Zoom can be wobbly. So maybe what we should do is just keep talking. And Ruth Anna will be back with us.
I've got to say that when Ebony mentioned that IRL, it's sometimes difficult to find these communities, these queer communities. I have had that experience. And actually the first, I'd say, place where I felt like I'd found my community was an online forum of other queer writers, sci-fi writers. And before that,
Mm.
it was often, I felt often very isolated, especially when I was getting my PhD in College Station, Texas, at Texas A&M University. Like I tried a couple times to find a community there, and just didn't pan out. Yeah, having the internet has been great, because like when I was growing up as a teenager, I didn't really have the internet. I'm kind of dating myself there, but once I got into college and a little bit older, I guess grad school, that's when I really like started exploring these online communities.
Mm. Yeah.
My fiance and I are always talking about how we should make more of an effort to get out there and build community and meet new people. We live in the Bay Area. This should not be hard. And yet somehow the easiest way to do it is to do it online, and to find folks on Twitter, or find folks through their writing, actually. That's one of the big ways to figure out, like, oh, okay, you're with me. Great.
Right. Yeah, I think finding people through our writing is a really significant way, because you already have something deeply in common. Um, I'm much more in favor of, let's try to do it in person. I know we can't do it this year, probably, but I think it's valuable to have links to others who are trying to do something similar, and it both encourages you and gives you kind of validation. I mean, I grew up, and let me date myself, Darcy, way dating back before you. But in the 70s, the feminist community had quite a few writers of speculative fiction. And it was my great joy to read everything that possibly came out. And like Pamela Sargent used to do an anthology of women of wonder. And then Joanna Russ, who was a lesbian speculative fiction writer, was one of my favorite writers. And she always created these strange communities. They weren't necessarily all lesbian or all queer, but she created these intense communities that were welcoming for someone like me. And she was an out lesbian, and I felt lucky to have that as my grounding, really, before I started writing the Gilda stories. So, and there are so many more writers of speculative fiction now. I mean, when I started writing the Gilda stories, it was published in 1991. People said to me, why would you write something about a vampire? Why would you want to connect that to lesbians? Why would you want to connect that to African Americans? Because the main character is a young girl who's a slave who escapes. And people were very negative. And it was a little bit upsetting, because I felt like, well, I'm a feminist, so I'm not going to write something exploitative. But it took a while for people to get that you could redo a mythology to your own use. But I had people like Joanna Russ and Pamela Sargent who could give me, show me a path. And that was really fortunate. And that was before I even read Octavia Butler or Samuel Delany. So I felt fortunate in that way. They kind of helped me have a path.
Well, I was blessed to have Delaney as one of my teachers in college. And back when I went to college, you couldn't write speculative fiction and have it Like, it was just like, no, we're not doing that. You just have to do strict realism. And it was also the time of not only strict realism, but it was like Raven Carver sort of no language, no embellishments or anything. And I was just totally into, I love the embellishments as much as I love the actual stories. So it was really a good thing that I ran into Delaney at that time, because I think that I would have gone in a completely different direction, or maybe even given up writing.
Yes, because he's a man who loves language. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, Delaney is actually one of the places where I've most seen queer communities in speculative fiction that look like the ones that I know. There's so much stuff you can read from a few decades ago, and it just looks like people were expecting the same family structures to go on forever. And then I read Stars in My Pocket Like Grains of Sin, and I said, oh yes, that's my life every day, only without the aliens.
When I first read, and this is, how we as queer people read ourselves into other narratives. When I first read Dune in 1965, I was sure that all of the members of the Bene Gesserit community were lesbians. They were all lesbian nuns. I was pretty sure of it. And I just love them. I love their power, their powers, their strength. And even though I think, as I recall, they may have been a bit evil, but often the evil characters are your favorite. But I read them as lesbian nuns, and I loved that. I loved that. But of course, that was, 1965. So.
Well, I would read into in Scooby-Doo, of course, Velma.
Yes, me too.
And it was just like, and it was sort of a shock that it was like, no, she's not canonically like, yes, she is.
There is a new Sean and McGuire, actually, I think it's a Mira Grant book that is essentially Scooby-Doo fan fiction and is very overtly queer.
So that's interesting, because we got some prep questions, and one of them will think about, works that you've read where they've had queer community. And strangely, Scooby-Doo was one when I was younger that I just assumed they were just like this happy little queer family. And I wonder what it is about that cartoon specifically that you also are like, well, Velma. Yeah, obviously, and yet not obviously.
Yes, and that then when what's her name, the vampire slayer,
Buffy.
Buffy, the vampire slayer, their team was called the Scooby-Doos, and I thought, yeah. Well, one of the things that you had asked us, Ruth Anna, I guess we were asking each other, is about depictions and of queer community. And one of the things that really bothered me a lot is that you couldn't get a queer community depicted often. It would be one queer person kind of out there on their own.
Which is so unrealistic.
Which is totally unrealistic. It also gives so little credence or weight to the idea of queer community. It's kind of like the way some movies would have one African American in the movie, and there would never be anybody else of African American descent or a person of color in the movie, just this one. And I think that was often what happened with us as queer people. And I know my first, what I thought of as a lesbian character, and it still is celebrated that way, is Carmilla, Sheridan Le Fanu's short story, Carmilla. And it depicts a young girl and her mother who are vampires, and they end up staying with a family, and the young girl vampire kind of seduces the young girl. And it's that kind of predatory thing that people don't like to see connected to lesbians. But for me, it was, here are two girls who are just drawn to each other and they cannot help that. And so they go for it. And it's a very, in many ways, unsatisfying, but it was the only thing out there that I saw in speculative fiction. Now, of course, that was written in the 1800s, but I think that is emblematic of a lot of what happens with queer people. We're in other, in literature, we're often the only one,
Yeah, which is hilarious because, yeah, you hear all the time, oh, you get, like, it's unrealistic for there to be so many queer people together, so many brown people together in one place. And it's like, actually, that's what we do. That's the safest place to be, is with ourselves.
Right.
Why wouldn't we be building these communities together? And why wouldn't it be your one odd straight person who like gets it, or your one odd white guy who's like, okay, you're fine, we'll allow you in? That's more likely to happen and more realistic than actually the singular person who just happens to hang out with all these straight people or all these white people. And I always think about it as like the core, when I was growing up, the core like Sailor Moon team, I was always trying to say like, no, one of you guys has to be queer, not the outer sailors that came later who actually were canonically queer, but like, there's 5 of you. One of you has to be a little bit somewhere on the spectrum. And I was always looking for like, okay, who's with who here, but not telling everyone else that that's what's happening. Because that just seems the most realistic, right? That like, even if you're gonna say we've got one person, there's probably somebody else who's not saying anything. We've got our one out person, and then the other person in the community who's trying to say something without saying something, is giving the wink or the nudge or the quietly not speaking their truth.
Yeah.
Also with the what I would like to call the Tootie conundrum, there can only be one, is that usually they are the ones that are sacrificed, particularly in horror movies. If the one black or the one queer, and then occasionally the black and queer person is the first one that is marked for death. Even if they are sensitively portrayed or anything, they automatically have to get all of the drama. And, the straight people are the ones that come out completely, or the white ones completely unmarked by it.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Do you all remember Night of the Living Dead, the film? And Dwayne Jones, who played the black man, who gets killed. You think he's going to make it, but then of course he gets killed. When Dwayne Jones retired from movies, he was in New York and he did theater. He had his own theater company. And at that time, I was a stage manager in theater. And he was great. I mean, he was a lovely, lovely man. He's since passed away, but he was a lovely, lovely man. And one of the things he said, because people always wanted to know about the making of Night of the Living Dead, he said, yeah, they killed me off and I was really pissed off, but you can look forward to decades more of the black man getting killed off before the end of the movie. And, at the time it just seemed like, oh, okay, well, how many more movies are there going to be with black people in them? Science fiction movies, I mean. But it turns out his prophecy was absolutely correct, So.
Do we have more recent films and books that are starting to break these patterns that you can recommend? Like, where are we seeing, people actually getting together with their own and going out and having adventures?
So this is a problem for me because I'm a big horror movie fan. So there's probably outside of the horror genre examples I don't know about. I can think of horror movies where I don't want to say the name of this movie because that would be a spoiler, but there is one. I could think of one where one gay character survives to the end. Unfortunately, another gay character dies. But yeah, it's difficult to, because like there's this final girl trope, and like, when do we get to be the final girl, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mentioned her earlier, but I have liked Shauna McGuire's Mira Grant stuff for this reason precisely. She writes books that are essentially horror movies, but where half of everybody is queer. She's got these two scary mermaid books, Into the Drowning Deep, and then I forget what the other one is called. But if you look up the one, you'll find the other. And it's the whole ensemble cast, and they're queer, and they're neurodiverse, and they're from different ethnicities and cultures. And so you know that the final girl is gonna be queer, and so are a lot of the people who die because you got it's following the script but with a different cast.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
And it does get the community thing.
I'd say that, for instance, Kaya Shante Wilson's work is mostly engaged in Black male queerness, and their entire groups of people together, entire communities, and that was an interesting change, from the usual. There can only be one. Um, that's one that sort of comes to mind.
Can you tell me the name of that author again?
Kai, Kai, middle name Ashante,
Uh-huh.
last one Wilson.
Okay.
And he just does, I think so far, only novellas,
Uh-huh.
form novella,
Great.
of Honey and The Sorcerer of the Wild Deep.
Great.
He has the short story in that same Taste of Honey world too, I think. But that made me think actually of Passing Strange, which is also a Tor novella and is very much like, here is a queer community. All the girls are hanging out, or all of the queers are hanging out together. There's some romantic stuff happening. There's lots of weird stuff happening, but like truly there is a community here. And I also like, maybe it's personal because I grew up here, but I love seeing the Bay play a major role. And they're constantly talking about San Francisco and what that was like in the, I want to say it's set in the 20s, early 30s, maybe, but really loved that.
That one is so good. Has anyone here read Ionadat Sharma?
No.
I will type the name in here conveniently for people to be able to sign and see. So I just read her novella, Sing for the Coming of the Longest Night, which is it's an urban fantasy where the two poly partners of this slightly flaky magician have to go and rescue him from the Fae. And it's full of queer community. And so, like, one of them is married to another woman and has kids, and the other one is involved in this radical queer collective where they all just hang out and support each other. And it's all these sorts of relationships that you almost never get to see in speculative fiction.
I remember reading Joanna Russ back in the day, and I can't remember, is it The Female Man? One of her books where a male character is nursing a baby. And it was like, whoa, that's interesting. And she was so great at introducing these ideas that people wouldn't have thought of at that time. And just sort of naturally, I mean, she did enjoy creating queerness in her books in a way that I think people were not ready for. People were not ready for in the 70s. But one of the most interesting things for me to have happened is for the culture to go from everything queer and speculative, or queer or speculative fiction, that, you know, including horror, was always out on the margins. It was never central or important until people started teaching classes in speculative fiction. And suddenly colleges had classes in writing or reading speculative fiction starting in the, you know, mid to late 80s. And I think that has made a big difference in the world of writers, people who are interested, more people are reading it, more people are studying it. And I know that's one of the reasons that my novel has stayed in print for 25 years, because every class that has speculative fiction uses the Gilda stories. Thank goodness. But has changed, I think, the landscape for us writers. There's more opportunities, there are more outlets, more people are interested in speculative fiction and are not turning their noses up at it, which is what I think a lot of people did. So in the surrealist, this is one of the reasons that I found myself feeling justified in writing speculative fiction. The surrealists in the 1930s said, in order to change the world, we had to first change our dreams. And I feel like writing speculative fiction is our way of changing our dreams, of reimagining the future. So I take it pretty seriously.
I think that brings me around to the question of the role that community plays in your own writing. And so, for example, things that you've written either because you'd seen them and wanted to see more of them, or because it was something you hadn't seen in fiction and wanted to put in there. And this one, I want to go around the room again and make sure we get to everyone. And I'll start again by picking on Craig.
What was the question again?
The role that community plays in your own writing and sort of what you're trying to feed by writing about community the way you do.
Well, it's funny with the book that I wrote, A Spectral Hue, that one was very much, it just turned out that everyone was gay. I didn't go around thinking about it. It was just, oh, this character is really flat. How could I bring them to life? Oh, I know, gay them up. And you know, that was a way of making, so it wasn't intentional, but sort of a project that I'm working on now is, actually it's coming up in a lot of other stuff that I'm doing. I have a story that will be coming out, which I can't really talk about, but I can say that it does deal with, the one teaser that I'll leave you with is that it does deal with the ballroom community, African American male ballroom community, and often trans ballroom community. And I working on another, I guess, a sort of mini book that is going to be about basically a community of queer conjure folk and how they all get together and sort of fight the Klan and whatnot. And most of them are going to be, they're either going to be LGBT or ace or something like that. At least one of them is ace. That's how it sort of is working. Because it's kind of difficult, because the flip side of this community thing is that I think a lot of writers, not every writer, but a lot of writers are kind of loners in some way. And so, you know, there's good things about community, and then there's like, I'm enough with people. You know? So.
Thank you. Darcy.
Yeah, just thinking of that loner thing. A lot of my short stories are about loners. In fact, let's see what an Alien Tide just came out. It's about a woman whose ultimate like goal in this story is just to be left alone. There's like this alien thing trying to like incorporate her into it. No, she just wants to be left alone. But in terms of community, my fiance and I, we're big comic fans, right? And uh, T especially is into this kind of high fantasy. So we actually made a web comic together. And this was before I was even like a published author. We put this online because we weren't really seeing what we wanted to see in the comics we were reading. Although, of course, I would just assume, like, I would read the X-Men and just like assume they're all queer until I know otherwise explicitly in this text. But in this web comic, yeah, everyone is some degree of queer, and they aren't blood related, but they're family. In terms of my writing too, when it comes to community, like I'm biracial, but Lip-On Apache. So I'm an enrolled Lip-On Apache. And a lot of our family systems, first of all, we're matrilocal. So in my works, just the importance and the role of mother and great grandmother and great great grandmother, like that's how I learn knowledge down that line. So I put that into my works, but also the extended community of cousins and, all sorts of, well, we'll call a second cousin a cousin, like cousins are cousins to us. So just in terms in my writing, I really want to honor both of those concepts, just the concept of my like indigenous understanding of family, as well as my like queer community that has really supported me, especially now.
Mm.
Cool.
Did you say me?
Yes, sorry.
Okay. You bombed out. Okay, so in my novel, the first one, and I'm working on the second one now, the vampire family is, it's a non-predatory and it's in opposition to a traditional images of vampires. And so the people that Gilda encounters who become her family are, so far as I can tell, they're all queer. And I was at a class, teaching a class at a college and in speculative fiction, and one of the students said, well, are you saying that all of your vampires are queer, are lesbian or gay? And I said, well, no, not all of them. At least they don't start out that way. And I have the feeling that for my characters, most of them in Gilda's family are queer. And it seems like if you're going to live forever, you get to do whatever you want. And so it just seemed natural to me that they would all kind of end up being queer and have a long view. I was raised by my great grandmother, who was an Iowa, and her long view of the world, she was born in 1883. So I felt like her long view of the world was really the view that I wanted my characters to have, a different kind of understanding of what it meant to be alive. And so the characters just ended up being queer for the most part. There's a couple in it who are not yet.
You got token straight people.
Yeah.
Hey, Ebony.
Yeah, like I said at the beginning, I think most of the stories I build have some sort of like queer community center to them. So in Stone and Steel, the main character, Leah, is an orphan and she's grown up sort of adding people into her whole and into her cause. And that's how she's built her community over time. She has people who she thinks of, I would say probably as like tangentially still in the family. Maybe we're not seeing each other constantly, but I still count you as one of us. And there are people who are very close to her at all times. And I think like I said, I think that's kind of essential. That's sort of the way I expect it to be. That doesn't mean everybody in the crew is queer. I think, yeah, I've got one token straight guy in the group, but I think the basis of most of what I write is around this like family unit, or this this community that then goes off to do amazing things. And that's true for Aaliyah. It's true in some of the short work I've written. So I don't think it ever actually made it into the short stories, but I have these 2 short stories that are in the same world, and they have that basis as well of like fighting vampires and fighting monsters, and also coming home to their like queer household, in which there are several relationships and several identities within that place, but everybody goes off to do their own thing and have their own stories, and just yeah, come back to each other at the end of the day.
Yeah, one thing I'm hearing people talk about a little here is multi-generational queer community, and that is something that straight writers, when they're putting in the token queer characters, often don't get, is that community can have that sort of continuity, and that's something that we actively try to build. And it's great that people are trying to depict that too. All right, we are not quite at quarter after, but I'm seeing questions starting to roll in, and some of these are really cool. So I think I'm going to switch over to the audience Q&A for now, and if we somehow run out, then I'll go back to the ones that we had in the queue for ourselves. I've got a really interesting question here. The idea that writers have been discouraged from writing monsters or monstrous traits in queer characters. Does that expectation still exist, and how are you choosing to represent the messiness of real queer communities in your current work?
Oh gosh. It is hard, really, I think, when when I write, I'm kind of a bean counter, because I don't want people to mistakenly think I think all white people are evil, or all Black men are evil, or whatever. So I count and figure out which characters are bad and which are good, so that it comes out even no matter what anybody tries to say. But writing queer characters who are negative, I've not really done that much until very recently. And I've tried to always give characters who are negative, there's a path that they were on to get to that. And certainly in the Gilda novel that I'm working on now, there is a very negative gay male character, and who gets killed off, obviously. But and only the way that a vampire can get killed off, really bloodily. But I try to, in writing the story, give that character a path so that we can understand he's not evil because he's gay. And I think that's the most we can do, really. But it is fun to write evil characters, I have to say that.
Yes, I'm actually going to throw in a second question that we got, which I think goes with this one nicely, especially with what you were just bringing up, which mentions that a lot of older works ascribe queer traits to antagonists, and many of us end up identifying with them, which I think we mentioned earlier, and how that affects how we look at the traditional dichotomy of the protagonist and the antagonist. So I think I'm throwing that in with the other question about how we balance this, worry about writing monstrous queer characters with the desire to have identified with the queer-coded monster, and then with the fact that if you're writing a community, there are going to be better and worse people in it.
Well, I'm writing this work that I'm currently writing, which is the serial novel Hair's Breadth, is kind of like a retelling of Rapunzel. And there has to be a witch in there, and the witch is queer. And the way I deal with the fact that she does practices that aren't good are that, number one, she kind of has to in order to survive. And number two, this idea that people that of ultimate good versus ultimate evil is very much a Western idea. In the novel that I published earlier, Spectral Hue, it deals with possession. And only in Western society is possession like considered verboten. It's if you go into the other religions, like particularly candomblé or voodoo, or all the various other sort of diasporic religions, you discover that the gods that they worship are both good and bad. They're just sort of forces of nature. They're not, Kali is not just this horrible thing. She's also about rebirth, and a lot of the Baron Smeedy and all these things, they all have a role to play. They're both good and bad. And so that's kind of how I sort of bring up the ambiguity of things.
Yeah, I think one of the ways.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry,
I
go
was
ahead.
interrupting you to ask if you want to say anything. I'm sorry.
Oh, perfect. I was going to say, yeah, I think one of the ways I handle this is just by having more than one queer character, and that sort of makes it easier then to believe, right, that queer people are not just evil, they're not just doing bad things, or that's not the reason why they're doing it. And when you've only got one in the whole narrative, right, it's hard not to make those connections and say, okay, this must equal that. But yeah, like my protagonist and antagonist for Stone and Steel, they're both queer. They were formerly together. So it's the reasons why one is evil and one is good. And even that, right, isn't actually true because they both have reasons for believing the thing that they're doing is the right thing. It has nothing to do with their queerness. I think that's the other thing, is to be explicit about, here's the reason why I'm doing this bad thing. And it has nothing to do with the fact that I'm queer. It's entirely because of these other ways these other things that have happened in my life, or the ways that I'm broken as a person that don't have to do with my queerness.
Yeah, and I have to, what everyone said already, I definitely agree with. To a certain extent, I do counting as well. And also, I do think that when you only have one character to be the spokesperson, or the one character that you're kind of forced to identify with, that does cause issues if they're like always the bad guy or always die first. And that's why I love seeing like works of fiction that include just a whole variety of people in terms of, villainous versus heroic, but also like personalities. Because I'm a nerd. Like I assembled a Plankton transcriptome. I love to read nerdy characters that I can identify with. I want to see more nerdy characters, more goth characters, like all sorts of personalities and stuff. But yeah, I do like villainous characters. Sometimes they're really fun to read about and write. So I think that's my answer.
I think a lot of people have, the early crush on the supervillain. I still think that Poison Ivy has some points about environmental sustainability.
Hey, Poison Ivy. I just finished cosplaying as Poison Ivy. Yes, in my headcanon, I have this whole background for her where she's basically her little no, I'm not going to get into it, but I agree.
Now I want to know what your headcanon is about.
Oh my gosh, I put it on Twitter. But yeah, I love how she is like canonically kissing Harley Quinn in the new cartoon. I am so excited about that. Little Harley.
We've also got a question: who or what are some publishers, magazines, or other spaces that you've found celebrating queer community? So where do people go for more of these stories?
Neon Hemlock, like I've been reading the novellas that have been coming out and just check them out.
Well, I would say Leafy Press was, one of the people that started doing queer only speculative fiction.
May sound biased, but FIA magazine always has something queer in it at all times, and obviously also Black. And I say biased because I'm managing editor for them, but I promise it's true regardless of that fact.
What's the name of it again, please?
FIA, FIYAH.
Right. Well, I think Tachyon Publishers has such a wide array of novels and novellas. They are really, really strong supporters of a diversity of writers. I'm not saying it just because Tachyon is in the Bay Area.
And another one I know about is Glittership, which is a really excellent queer zine. And then also being self-interested, the Tor.com imprint does a lot of queer authors and novellas, and occasionally novels, including mine. But they've been a good home for that.
And I guess this is, I was going to hold off because they're publishing me, but Levine Carrito for young adults in terms of spec fic, that's also very queer. They're a new small publisher, but I've been looking at the books that they're going to publish in the future, and there's a lot of really cool ones. But again, it's young adult fiction, so not adult fiction, but I like them both.
Great. Great. We have to get them while they're young, I say.
Yes. I know it when growing up, I just read whatever was in the school library, and let's just say that there was not a lot. So wish I had that when I was growing up.
Are we seeing more stuff in YA? I know that mainstream YA is getting more queer works.
I have to say I'm really looking forward to Cemetery Boys. That's the next kind of spec YA that I'd like to read. So once I read that, I'll be talking about it. But yeah, I've been seeing a lot of really exciting things.
Oh, Naomi Kritzer's Catfishing on Catnet, which just won a couple of awards, has queer online community as a big part of it, with an AI as part of the queer online community. So that's fun. We have a follow-up question about what are your relationships like with queer-coded villains?
Let me mention one thing in terms of young adults. Nnedi Okorafor,
Yeah.
she writes some amazing characters and amazing stories for young adults.
Yes.
Yeah, and using a lot of African culture, which I find really wonderful, really wonderful. So I'm sorry, what was that question again?
Following up, looking for more detail on relationships with queer-coded villains and how that plays into how we read and write.
Queer-coded villains.
A lot of the villains, particularly Disney villains, were given campy aspects, and you can't avoid that, And I remember being very little and absolutely adoring Maleficent. Like the Princess Aurora, who cares? She was basic, but that's where Maleficent was where it was at. And not only is she evil, she revels in her evilness. That is one of the things that I think is the same thing with the Wicked Witch or Ursula. They all love the fact, and it obviously is coded as queer. It's like, I'm here, I'm queer, and I'm going to be the biggest one in the world, Also, I'd say, in Dune, Frank Herbert wanted to make the Baron Harkonnen like
Yeah.
the kind of, as proof of his decadence, he liked young boys and all that sort of stuff. But he was also, he had more character than Paul did, because Paul was just, you know, standard
He was
white,
like a cipher. Paul was like a cipher.
standard white dude hero, you know.
Yeah, I'm also thinking now about how in like the Disney villains, they don't get communities. They're all by themselves. But then in comics, villains get to have community. Like Magneto has the Brotherhood. And if you have a team of superheroes, you have to have a team of supervillains to meet them.
Yeah.
So we're down to our last 5 minutes. So I'm going to ask people to close out with thoughts about what you'd like to see more of in speculative community. Craig.
Well, I would like to see more generational queerness. The fact of the matter is that I come from a multi-generational queer family, and it's never discussed about. You know, my one of my uncles was gay. Almost every other relative is some stripe of some. And you know, we mostly have hidden it from each other for a variety of reasons. But I want to see more of that expressed. I also want to see more queer parents. You know, that a lot of the particularly gay male stuff that I read is all about, you know, the hedonism and all that stuff. But there's a certain point where the hedonism gets boring and you want to have kids and you want to build equity and that sort of thing. So I want to see more mundaning of things. Also, I want to see more poly relationships explained, and not just the sort of sexy part, but also the boring part where it's just like, okay, I'm going to budget for this and that sort of thing.
Darcy.
Yeah, just going on what Craig said about, like families. I'm thinking of a lot of the horror that I read and write. Like they have like the main characters are like these families, and I would love to see that with more queer families. I just as a horror reader. But yeah, I guess that's my number one thing, more queer horror.
Joel.
Um, I was just trying to remember. Well, and I'm with Craig on that. I'm interested in seeing, obviously, older queer people. And I wrote a part of the new Gilda novel is Gilda meets a witch who's over 100 years old, and they make love. And for Gilda, it's trying to understand the feeling of being old because she's never going to grow old. And that was very interesting and fun for me. And so I do want to write more older characters who are either vampires or witches, because I feel like that generational aspect of our lives is really important. I also am interested in seeing, and I was trying to remember the name of this a very popular trans speculative fiction novelist, and I'm going blank. I don't.
There are a
Hopefully-
bunch of them.
Jane Anders.
Probably Jane Anders.
Right. But I'm interested in seeing how non-trans writers will incorporate trans characters into our work in a way that's, realistic and respectful, so that trans writers aren't the only people who end up having to write them. And I think that will be an interesting development in our in our community of writers. I have not as yet done so, but
And
I'm working my way toward it.
finishing up with Ebony.
Awesome. Yeah, I think a lot of what everyone else has said is stuff I would love to see as well. And I think just the biggest thing is that sense of community and a little less of this like, you know, one token queer in a sea of straightness is the most important thing, or even just more queers together, as opposed to the singular queer person leading their own life and being a loner. I think it's just nice to see people be in community with each other. Like I said, I don't necessarily do that personally, but that's why I like to see it, it written down, because that is my opportunity, right, to explore and enjoy that. And so that's one thing I think I hope to see more of in the future. Did we lose Ruthanna entirely?
Is it your turn, Darcy?
I guess
You've
that's
already-
the end of the panel.
Thanks for being here, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
I think we did lose Ruthanna, but this was fun.
That was fun. It was really great to talk to everyone.
I'm sorry we didn't have more time. We could have really dug deep in here, but this was great.
Yeah, did
I
Ebony,
love-
you get to say a bit?
Yes,
Yeah.
I did.
But I froze up just as I was calling on you there.
I feel really happy to meet you all as writers, kind of new to me. I'm very excited. It'll give me some things to read.
Okay, cool.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ruthanna.
The audience.
Thank you.
Bye.